We are straight up 12 noon. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Beef on Dairy Dialogue series. It's an extension of the annual Dairy Beef Short Course held in conjunction with the Central Plains Dairy Expo each March. The short course is the longest running program focusing on steers with dairy genetics in the U.S. with 15 years of continuous programming. The short course is sponsored by the I-29 Boo University, a consortium of extension specialists from Iowa State University, University of Minnesota, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and South Dakota State University. The 2026 Beef on Dairy Dialogue continues today with a presentation by Chip Kemp with 701X on aligning your beef and dairy goals with your beef sire selections. Chip Kemp is the Director of Strategy for 701X. His duties are wide-ranging as he works to aid various segments of the beef business with a suite of novel and innovative 701X tools. Prior to 701X, Chip served for roughly a decade as the Director of Commercial and Industry Operations for the American Simmental Association and International Genetic Solutions. His role for that team covered an array of duties from assisting progressive commercial producers with genetic awareness of crossbred cows to the development of new technologies that highlight the profit potential of genetic knowledge in the beef industry, regardless of the beef type. Before ASA, Chip was an instructor for 18 years at University of Missouri. In this role, he was involved with classroom teaching, coaching, competitive livestock judging, oversight of internships, and the coordination of USDA-approved meats processing facility. As I always say, Chip, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Fred. To be frank, it's a little gross when we hear people talk about ourselves that much. So thank you, and don't do that anymore. So that's cool. In interest of everybody's time, I too will try to be prompt. I'm going to effort to be done with plenty of time here to spare for either you to chase follow-up questions or for you to pursue the balance of your day. So I'm going to stop sharing my videos while we do this, and then we'll come back as time unfolds. So. This is an extension of a conversation that we had back in the fall at an event in Chicago. And so just wanted to pull on this thread a little bit more. And so the challenge I would assert, especially when we start with the conversation of genetics, the ideal sire types and those sort of commentaries within the beef on dairy space is in some ways, we do a great job of focusing on certain data points. Other opportunities maybe we're not as attuned with, or maybe haven't accepted quite as much as we're looking for novel ways to look at genetic awareness and the appropriate phenotypes and measures to capture. So I'm going to ask that we use all of our context clues, just like I had teachers ask back in the day. And the thing I remind the folks that are on this call is that you're involved in the premium supply chain in the beef business, and that doesn't mean it doesn't come without some serious challenges and efforts on everybody's part, but there's also unparalleled opportunity. The question is, can we build those solid fundamentals now while the dynamics are quite strong and solid, so that in particular for those who are running dairies, when the dynamics change a bit and maybe historically would want to trend away from the favorability of the beef on dairy calf, maybe you'll have built so many fundamentally positive pieces that the beef industry can't take that step, that it has to stay totally engaged with you. So just a little bit of a history reflection for myself. And I think so much of this comes in such a short window of time. And so I kind of refer to it as the wild, wild west full of Steins and Jerseys and others, because ultimately, what we saw was this window of time, less than a decade to see this go from something that wasn't even discussed, it wasn't even a thing, to clearly a different spot. And I like referencing G.K. Chesterson's quote here, and I think it really fits the last 10 years. Maybe not the last couple few, but prior to that, from 2015 to maybe the early 2020s. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And so often we hear a slightly more personalized, more aggrandized version of that quote. But I think the reason this one works so well is you don't start out being great at something. That isn't the way this works. And sometimes we live under this delusion that, man, I just jump into the water and I swim to the other end of the pool like a champion. It doesn't work that way. We flounder a bit. And it's no question that's what we did from I don't know, from the early stage of this until reasonably recent. And so we did a lot of things. We threw a lot of stuff up against the wall, and that kind of fail fast model sometimes doesn't work. By golly, it aligned with the market forces and the conditions in this case to work really, really well. And so as a result, one of my contentions, and it was maybe a bone that I threw out there and when we visited last up in October in Chicago, was that largely, I think there are some industry players who have pretty got a pretty good handle at this point on what beef genetics actually work in the dairy business, and we'll kind of pull on that thread just a little bit. But most of that came to pass because of less than a decade of let's get busy learning what we don't know and doing it really quickly. Now the challenge is how do we adapt to an area where some of the things that just a few years ago we didn't have a handle on, all of a sudden we got a pretty clear handle on. What are we willing to do about that? That's really the question to me as I look at this. So these things, a number of you on here, you see and hear these things, but I just want to refresh because this is kind of where I came into this space. I'm very straightforward. Fred knows I'm not a dairy guy. My greatest connection to the dairy business were dear family friends that we went to church with down the road from me growing up. That was it. That was my extent. But in my professional career, as things have evolved from the beef side, I started engaging in the beef on dairy discussion, I think before it was really even a topic in the industry. About 2016, I was starting to have some internal conversations with my former team at the American Simmental Association and at International Genetic Solutions that it seemed there might be something afoot. And at the time, a lot of folks questioned that, but I think we stuck with it, and I think it proved to be somewhat accurate because we saw this develop. And I actually like putting these two units together. I think seeing the change in beef semen and dairy semen on the same graph is quite helpful to us because it to me comes at a bit of a point of convergence. It seems like we've found a bit of a comfortable equilibrium where, and this added beef semen, I think everybody in this call knows, is not really going in beef cattle. That added beef semen is clearly, as the graphic displays, just displaced the dairy semen. And to prove that point, the number of dairy cattle has stayed steady. In fact, has maybe even arguably increased slightly over that window of time. And so we're still doing the same number of matings and all of those things. It's just with beef semen, something everybody on this call knows. A part of the wild, wild west of this time was much often discussed carcass length. And many of you on here probably spend some time in some major beef packing plants. I have. It's been a part of my training, a part of my career. I was blessed to be able to do so. Before I taught at the University of Missouri, I spent a couple years at the world's largest beef packing plant in Amarillo, Texas. And that was foundational for me to understand a lot of things, just the basic challenges of that manufacturing environment. I've seen what it means to a production system when a carcass is too long, what you have to do to make that change. I've also seen just basically when carcasses are too heavy and sides are going down a rail and they overwork a system and they drop an entire rail on the ground. I've seen it. I know what that takes. And so, over the last, 10 years ago, I openly said, and less than that, probably 6 or 7. I would openly say that carcass length was one of the serious considerations we had to come to when it came to beef sires. Because, as you all understand quite well, a Holstein's a big thing. And if we exacerbated that by a beef animal who was another big thing, we just beget problems. However, that's largely been muted. Not so much by the size of a Stein or a beef animal, though in some spots that's the case. But the biggest issue is most plants have modified rail height. And so now, and they've planned with a little bit of forethought because, we went from not very long ago when, talk about a 1,300 pound steer to be the norm to now we're expecting our average group in a plant to be roughly 1,500 pounds. And we know on any given day in a plant, you're going to see an 18, 19, 2,000 pound carcass. That's going to happen in any major plant on essentially every day. And you rarely see something that's back on the very light end of that equation. And so we had to adapt. And once we did, that actually made the discussion of the ideal beef genetics for the beef on dairy space much, much clearer. And so that tension is dissolved. And that was a part of that kind of time frame of that wild, wild west dynamic. And so, given some of those things, some of the various dynamics that came to play, what really it's come down to is that sire selection has become pretty clear. Some of you in here have heard me say before, I quote a former colleague of mine who would consistently remind me that clarity is kind. Clarity is kind. And I may not like the answer, but at least we can do something about it. And I think what we're seeing here is that what we know at this point is the packer has a demand, the feedlot has a demand, the customer has a demand. We'll talk about those here in a few minutes. But to make it really crude and simple, you make them big and rich meated, or in other words, big and they marble well, you're going to get paid good. You don't do that, it's not going to work. And so we have a pretty good handle on this. Same time, largely, we understand which genetics don't work, at least in a large aggregate sense. I'm not going to take up all of my time doing a historical retrospective, but I would encourage you to take a look at a particular talk that was given back at the 2025 BIF. I think if you were to find that, Beef Improvement org, I think is the website. If you go there, you can find their 2025 symposium, and there was an entire session on beef on dairy. Some very, very knowledgeable and diverse folks talked on that, and I think they really lay out that era, the last decade, quite well, and kind of tell us where we're at. So I'd encourage you to look at that if you want more of that perspective. So I'm going to do something I don't like to do very often, and that's speak in very gross terms about these large arbitrary structures that we call breeds. In many cases, these animals are starkly different in contrast to other breed top populations. In other areas, these arbitrary lines are pretty blurred. And so recognize that I'm doing something just to kind of add some brevity and clarity, but this is a gross overgeneralization in some spots, and I recognize that. So you all understand that at this point, there are really about five breeds that make up the bulk of the beef on dairy conversation. There are clearly others. And I encourage that because if you're somebody who can mine data and you can find that unique diamond in the rough that you can get at a price point that allows ROI to work for you and you don't have to compete against everybody else who's trying to compete against one of these, cool, good on you. That's the way a man makes money or a lady makes money. But we can't ignore the large sense. These are the creatures that impact beef on dairy supply chains. And yes, one of those does look a little different than the others. And some of you, if you remember back to your FFA poster back in the day, you just said you might even say, well, two of those aren't supposed to look like that. Semis and limis aren't supposed to look like that. Well, we should update our FFA poster. They haven't looked like those other things in quite a little bit. So these are representations of those breeds. But again, as I referenced, beef breeds aren't monoliths. And fortunately, you'll probably have some semen company friends who are on here, but I would contend specifically in the beef on dairy space for way too long, we pretended that a breed was a monolith, that they all functioned the same, and that just is juvenile and silly. And folks have realized that and started making much more sharp penciled, thoughtful, focused selection decisions on those sires who make it within a beef on dairy program, much in the same way that they did when they were making decisions on your Holstein sire selection, your Jersey sire selection for years upon years upon years. And unfortunately, it took a little too long for us to get to that point with selecting the ideal sires for the beef on dairy space, but I think we're largely there. And so just to drive that kind of that dynamic of those handful of breeds uh, uh, into this graphic, you can see when you pile them all up by some margin, at least over the course of a few years, uh, some of the Continentals are coming in pretty close. They're chasing in terms of are they second, are they third? But everybody's far back from Angus in terms of semen influence on beef on dairy. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Many quite good. Some probably less good. There's a lot of availability. There's a lot of growth for those who maybe aren't as familiar. We'll talk about this in a moment as well. Angus cattle, they gain really well. That makes money in a feed yard situation. And so that's kind of where we see this. But I plant this one question, and we will come back to it a little bit later. So this is kind of what the graphic looks like now. It's what the graphic looks like today. Is there reason to think this graphic might change in a significant level? And I would say maybe we'll put a pin in that. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the pros of these different breeds. Again, I can't help but continue to say what I said a moment ago. This does not hold true across every animal within these breeds. This is a gross overgeneralization. Angus, low-cost semen. We all understand the value of the Angus name in today's marketplace. And we don't want to delude ourselves. We have a lot of folks on occasion, especially on the more traditional beef side, who have a lot of angst about that, and they wish that weren't so. And for those of you who can see the video screen, or we're on the beginning, or we'll see me again when I turn my video back on. There are a lot of things one might wish for. One might wish for hair, or a whole bunch of things. We don't want to ignore the obvious, and that name has value, and that's not lost on the industry. Those Angus cattle, that's where the growth, like physical growth, has really came from in the beef business in recent years. In fact, average daily gain is a real strength of the modern Angus creature. Now that's coming to trade off of some maternal metrics and so those sort of things, but those aren't relevant in the beef on dairy space. And of course, Angus cattle have kind of set the benchmark, as it were, for high marbling cattle. And as a result, that's changed eating quality immensely in this country to the point that tenderness, when you look at the most recent beef quality audit from a couple years ago, uh, tenderness, which was a major concern just 25 years ago, even 15 years ago, we were talking about it all the time and how we were going to change systems to address tenderness. Most recent beef quality audit says tenderness is all but no problem at all. That is in no small part due to some selection from marbling. Even though they're different traits, there's some crossover, and we can have a meats conversation at another time. Second breed will highlight that Limousin or that Limb Flex. Certainly the first major continental influence in the modern beef on dairy business. Now, we can go back a few decades, and we all know that when the Continentals started coming in this country in the late 60s, early 70s, there certainly were Continentals used in dairy business. Many of you probably grew up seeing some of that. But in terms of what we think of as this formulaic supply chain effort, this really didn't happen until a much more recent time, and everybody on this call almost certainly knows the Limousin family and the team that built that model and still runs that model very, very successfully today, and certainly changed the way we think about the calves that come out of a dairy operation. Simmental, again, probably the primary continental player. I hope that terminology makes sense. I think it probably makes sense to everybody, but we have British cattle from the British Isles and Continentals from the rest of Europe. You probably remember that from previous discussions. Red meat yield is a strength of Simmental's added feedlot performance. They have a little bit of a marbling advantage over the other Continentals. They certainly aren't at the Angus level, however. Wagyu. Now, we talk about marbling here. Here's kind of the baton grabber. They do a really good job of pushing marbling at a high level from a large breed-wide perspective. And that name too, while not as synonymous across an entire industry as Angus, it has certainly cultivated a premium brand name. And there's no question that it packs a punch. I was in Las Vegas for the last few days for a convention for something, and you all know the same as I that almost every menu in a place like that is going to have some Wagyu product. The other thing that I think we cannot ignore, we just simply cannot ignore it. That name wouldn't have came as far as it has and as strong as it has if it wasn't for it's tied to some very significant and sophisticated corporate structures. Those of you who know the history of the Wagyu breed in the US, it looks totally different than essentially every other breed type. And some of that probably comes with some struggle and some bad. Some of it comes with some really good things. They are tied to folks who understand business quite well. And in fairly short order, went from a name that was unpronounceable by the bulk of humans in the US to one that is aligned with very sophisticated business models. And then the last one, of course, would be Shars. And of course, they are like the feedlot experts. They trump everybody in terms of a generalization on the ability to just go out and perform in a feed yard, stay healthy, grow, get efficient. So there are certainly some cons, no doubt. Each of those breeds, nothing's perfect. No single breed, no single animal is the ideal. As a population, Angus cattle have a little bit of a concern with red meat yield. By that I mean lean protein accretion, lean protein production. That gives way at times to a little extra fat content. Comes with the pro that I spoke about a moment ago. Also, heart health has become a bit of a concern. Just maybe some, what I'll call some of the longevity-minded traits can be a challenge. And it's not just Angus, to be clear. This is not throwing stones at anybody. This is just pointing out that there are populations of cattle who are derived from certain selection criteria over centuries. And some of the things that come in their background matter. Angus cattle were developed in fairly lowland territory where there was minimal heart stress, as opposed to some of the continentals who were developed in upland mountainous areas where there was just more pressure on their heart, and so it's kind of baked into the cake. Not a lot we've done as breeders to deal with that, except for maybe in very recent times. Most of it was just kind of packaged in. Some of the cons, Limousin cattle certainly can marble well in today's business. They probably aren't going to marble it maybe the ultra level of a few of the breeds we spoke about. And in some cases, they might struggle to get to some of the ultra weights that I mentioned earlier. And again, to be clear, there's almost zero sign that from a long-term trend, those weights aren't going to continue. We can talk about that, but finished steer weights have risen significantly. I didn't put any graphics in here because not germane necessarily to this talk. But there's zero reason to believe they're not going to continue. And we can harvest almost anybody in the business now can ship a 1,700 pound steer with no discount, but try to ship a 1,250 pound steer, that can hurt. And so that's just the trend. That's where we're going. And again, it's a piece of the business that allows everybody to add some efficiencies through the production system, and it actually aligns really well, maybe more so with the beef on dairy model than the traditional beef model. We can talk about that later if you like. Simmentals, again, kind of a utility player, as I sort of mentioned in the last graphic. And so that's good or bad. And so you can determine where you feel about that. They may not be the maximal choice for any one category that affects profitability in these cattle, but they do all of them pretty well. And so it's kind of a maximum versus optimum thing. Wagyus, they're not made to gain. Part of the reason they marble so well and do it in the fashion they do is it's a long-term process, a slow evolution of the composition of that creature. It doesn't hurry very well, and so feedlot performance is a challenge. And so Wagyus work really well in an area where you get paid for that ultra premium product. If you're going to try to use Wagyu, high percentage Wagyu cattle in a commodity feed yard, it's going to hurt you really, really bad. Even in this market, you might struggle to make money if that were the case. And so, and again, they too have a bit of a red meat yield concern. And then, of course, Shars. The color makes it difficult, makes it impossible actually to get CAB premiums. There are some other Angus-oriented premiums they can have access to, but those tend to come with a smaller price tag. Marbling tends to be their biggest concern from a beef on dairy model standpoint. So again, to kind of wrap up this discussion on the Wild Wild West, as it were, this is just one graphic. You all have seen some version of this graphic, I have no doubt, in the last year or so. This is just one example, not the only example, probably the most pronounced example of a very sophisticated system that has vertical alignment, much like some other protein sources we know. I think this is important as we lay the groundwork for where we fit in, whether you're on here as an academic, a small regional producer, maybe you're involved in a large production chain somewhere. These things we can't ignore. This has fundamentally changed the business. We have just as many cows, a fraction of the number of producers. That's the way this is at present. And so that this faculty number piece is an artifact from the previous time I gave portions of this talk because it does affect those who are trying to make research opportunities come to play. You have to think about those a little bit different. So the last thing I'd say on this screen is a mentor of mine is very good at reminding me that how to do genetic evaluation and do genetic evaluation very well. However, even for these folks who may not have to be quite as pristine with individualized data, when you have critical mass and significant critical mass and you're making decisions off of that, you're doing genetic evaluation. And in this case, you have an outfit that has significant individualized data and critical mass, and they are aware they're going to know the ideal beef on dairy sires for their particular cow herds quicker than any of the rest of us could possibly fathom. And to be clear, they do. Every semen company has a very good handle on these things. Every large scale beef on dairy supply chain understands these things pretty well. It's pretty sophisticated at this point. And so, um, I would then just kind of come to the reckoning, as it were, is we look at folks who have come at this from different standpoints, different places in the industry. Much like a traditional beef conversation, sometimes one of the things that comes up most frequent is somebody will just say, well, Chip, I'm sure they tell the same thing to Fred and others on this call is, I just want to get a little leverage in the business. And we hate to be brutal or cruel, but we also just want to be honest. If you have to ask if you have leverage, then the answer is you don't. And that's just a hard cold reality. Leverage requires critical mass and a uniform and consistent supply number. And if you have that, even if your cattle are maybe not as good as somebody down the streets, but if you have more and they're consistent and you can fill shackle space and feedlot space, you're going to get suitors. It is that simple. And sometimes that works, like I said, in these collaborative supply chain models. And that fits, again, the beef on dairy system quite well for many of us. So that is not to insinuate that the only way to be profitable in this is to chase the primary commodity market. Case in point, going back to the Wagyu discussion, that's exactly not what they're doing, right? They're kind of decommoditizing themselves. And so they've tried to not work in the traditional system. That's what's made them successful. Beef on dairy cattle in the traditional commodity market, Wagyu on dairy cattle in the traditional commodity market probably would struggle, but they don't struggle because they don't play that market. So, from my standpoint, just a very quick cap on what are some of the industry desires and pain points associated with this population in cattle. And these are relevant as we're considering sire decision and genetic decisions, even on the dairy side, right? As we're concerning ourselves with whole life cycle metrics, whole life cycle indexes on a Holstein or a Jersey or a Hojo cow or what have you. If we can continue to look at overall lifetime profitability, in many cases, that profitability now is largely driven by end product, end beef product value as well. And so it kind of comes into the equation, then you have to balance it with actual milk production. So anyway, here are some of the industry desires when it comes to that terminal animal that's leaving your dairy operation from that ultimate consumer kind of restaurateur grocer level. Uniformity, consistency, palatability. You all, if you're involved in the beef on dairy supply chain, you check those boxes really, really well. That is maybe as much as anything the reason for my statement of the premium supply chain in the business, because beef on dairy carcasses tend to have a much greater uniformity than the native beef calf out there. Consistency kind of comes together, but it's not only consistency of shape and size and all of that, it's consistency of production, right? You're breeding cows routinely, not in two seasonal opportunities. And so the supply chain, the flow, the just on time dynamics just work a little bit easier for portions of the supply chain. Palatability is great. The challenge here for most, as we know, the calf ranch becomes a little bit of a challenge. That story is something that is an area we need to highlight and work on to appeal to the end consumer. Packers, they're driven by pounds, marbling, and red meat yield. Pounds on the beef on dairy calf, they don't have to compete with the biggest beef carcasses. That's not the point. But they have to do it effectively and be big enough, and they certainly can be. Marbling can be stellar. Red meat yield can be a little bit of a problem in these cattle, and we'll talk briefly about that here in a moment. Feeders, that feedlot, he wants you to stay alive and perform, period, done, end of story. And this is a little bit of a mixed bag. There are certainly beef on dairy cattle that can perform very, very well. Again, are they going to outperform some of the highest octane natives? No, they're just not. But they don't have to. They just have to deliver at a certain level of gain, a certain level of feed to gain and efficiency, and do it consistently at scale over and over and over again. And that's what they do. The concerns clearly death loss, a bit associated with hearts, but probably the bigger issue is either the death loss and or the discounts associated with livers. Oh, that is much discussed, and I won't go into that too much today. There are much more sophisticated experts than me in the liver conversation, but we all know that's something that can't be ignored. And then the modern implant strategy in a feedlot, the fact that we've been limited on implant strategies does make it harder as these cattle live in a feedlot for an awful long time. So it really does have a bit of a blow to the performance and efficiency of some of these cattle. The story, the calf ranch, again, predictability of performance, you understand that. I, I would argue that I think one of the real holes in this space is the ability to individual monitor. And the reason I say that is because I think we lose a lot of knowledge in hutch, but also there are portions of the business who are starting to push harder and harder against the hutch, which would certainly help with the story, but you still want that individual knowledge. And so would there be ways in small group situations to continue to get that individual knowledge? And I'll poke at that at the very end of this call or the end of this talk. And then, of course, as seed stock folks and commercial dairy people, it was, from a commercial standpoint, it's very much get them bred, make me a live calf. And that's kind of the focus at that level. So, from my standpoint, it really boils down to maybe these six things in kind of a large sense. Give me a live calf, keep it healthy all the way through. Um, the how, and this is kind of a bit of a chronological approach. The housing method, can we continue to improve societal perception of that and still accomplish all the things we know we need to accomplish? Time on feed, that implant strategy, that's beyond my scope of expertise, but we best not ignore it. It's a vital one. I highlight red meat yield and I highlight another one here in a different color because they'll be the two I pull on the most here in the next few minutes for a couple different reasons. Red meat yield has been much discussed and talked about in the last couple of years, and it seems like maybe for the first time ever, the industry has really pushed the USDA into a direction where it's going to embrace getting more clarity on this topic. And so I think that's useful, and I think ultimately we're going to come to some solutions. What that looks like in the near term is a little still up in the air, of course, but there are serious movements there. Liver abscess, again, talked about, understood, better experts, it's a problem. There's a genetic component, probably in this case, much more of an environmental management component. I think everybody would agree on that. And then the last one, which kind of covers all these areas, is the lack of individualized metrics. As we think about the concept of precision agriculture and how that's changed certain aspects of just global agriculture en masse, we're still largely thinking in this space on individual, or excuse me, as group averages. And there's a place for that, and that's certainly not unhealthy, and you can get a lot done with that. But at the same time, we're probably getting to an area where certainly that's no probably about this. We're getting to a level where we want to know more about every animal in Japan without necessarily the cost of individualized metrics. We'd still like those to be able to play nice with a mainstream production system. We don't all want to have to turn every commercial dairy into an R&D plant. And so are there ways we can do that? And I'll touch on both of these. So red meat yield. as far as I'll go, there has been a significant and serious and competent group of individuals put together at the behest of the Beef Checkoff called the Red Meat Yield Working Group. You're probably familiar. You may have even had some of them on some of these sessions. Um, I would tell you follow that. There are a number, John Sticka, who runs CB, some of the folks that are on the screen right now. There are a number of very serious and influential and savvy industry minds working on this problem and pushing it through the appropriate channels. And USDA seems to be keen on playing along to help come to a solution. From my standpoint, the three individuals I feel are probably the most vested over a longer term on this are a few different academics from the South, from West Texas. By West Texas, I mean geographically West Texas, because Texas Tech is in West Texas, and West Texas A&M is in the Texas Panhandle. And so Doctors Warner, Forker, and Lawrence are I'm blessed because they're all friends, but more importantly, they're just blasted good at this. And so they're working on a lot of novel ways to dig into this. And essentially, really what the concern is for those of you who might be like, I'm not sure I'm completely up to date on this one, is in the dairy cattle in particular, it's a problem. The USDA yield grade equation is a problem in native beef cattle. It was built on a population from many decades ago that just no longer fits the current beef population in the US. And so for a long time, we've recognized that the yield grade model is woefully inadequate and out of date. However, in the traditional beef side, it still does a pretty solid job of breaking those carcasses down into these classification breaks of 1 to 5 that denote on a gross sense who's pretty lean and who's pretty fat. And it allows a packer to make some economic decisions on how they pay the valuation of those carcasses based on that yield grade. So while it should be fixed purely on its lack of accuracy relative to the native beef business, it hasn't been. What really has driven it is the start of the beef on dairy model, and that is because the dynamic of both ribeye size, the lack of muscling conformation in parts of the body that the yield grade equation before never really considered. It only looks at ribeye area, which only, we know now, only actually has about a 12%, give or take, predictive ability for overall muscle composition, overall muscle or lean yield. So that yield grade equation can't account for as it sits that lack of muscle in the round, that lack of muscle in the chuck. And so as a result, what packers find themselves do is if they consider the USDA equation for yield grade, which to this point they've just completely disregarded in beef on dairy cattle, but if they were, they'd be losing significant amount of poundage. They thought they paid for something when they bought it, and that lean protein to sell doesn't materialize because there just isn't enough in the end cuts of the carcass. And so lots of work going on this front. And I'd encourage you, if you're not following it, follow it. But it does bring me back to a question that I threw out early in this visit, and that is when you look at the proportion of different breed types that are prevalent in the beef on dairy component, should this red meat yield conversation continue to evolve, I think it's going to, well, I don't think there'd be any think. When the red meat yield equation does get updated, folks will be forced to make some serious decisions on sire selection and how those sires align themselves with that new yield grade equation or red meat yield or whatever they call it at that point in time. And so the cattle will have to adapt and adjust. They will source cattle that find those. And certainly within the Angus population, there are cattle that can work very well in there. Maybe some don't work as well. So does that have a chance to disrupt maybe the disparity between Angus and some of the others? Maybe. Maybe it doesn't. So it's an open question, but something to ponder. So I highlighted two red areas. I wanted to point out this red meat yield discussion and where it's going to go in terms of sire selection. But maybe in a larger sense, the last area I want to touch on, and I don't want to go too far because this is not supposed to be a commercial. I'd rather it be just kind of a conversation and kind of a what if and spark some thought process. But the other is how do we start to chase individualized metrics that we can use on farm to do things better, in feedlot to do things better, to make more informed decisions, but also ultimately to circle back into genetic evaluation so that we can get better beef sires, we can get better female genetics on the other side. And so just real quick, I'll highlight a few tools that are coming to pass in different parts of the business. that do a few things. They provide individualized metrics, and they can go different directions from different firms that can get there. But when you do that, it does allow you to chase data points that are relevant, both phenotypes and health measures, in particular health measures that we don't have a very good handle on in the beef business. In the dairy business, you all understand some of that. In the beef business, if we're going to aid you in building beef genetics that are healthier, it's been a real void because we're, of course, large country. It's more difficult to measure some of these things. So we now have tools that connect remotely and those sort of things that can give us, yes, in hutch metrics, but also metrics in group housing environments and still stay individualized or in feedlot settings. Those sort of tools allow for maybe a bit of a rethink in certain situations of how you house those animals. That can aid with the story where appropriate. They also become HR aids. People around me hear me much often say everything's an HR play. In this environment, everything we do is an HR play. And if it's not for a hired employee, that HR aide it's maybe just as focused many times at our own children. Do they want to get back in this business? Can we find ways where they don't have to work 30 hours a day, 8 days a week, still stay informed, stay effective at their craft? And so again, I think these things come into that. But the biggest issue is they just provide us novel data points that we've just never been able to track in the past. This visual, and I'm not going to go into this data set because that would be inappropriate. It's an individual researcher's data set of a bunch of calves who are providing activity and health metrics in hutch. Actually, they're actually out of hutch now. I should be honest. They were in hutch at the beginning of their life. Now they're in a group housing um, as they grow through the process. We're not going to talk about the data on those because it's not mine to talk about. But I will give you just another little brief example of a small R&D pin at a research institution somewhere. These are not beef on dairy calves, to be honest. But if you looked at a number of them, you could say, yeah, they surely could be. But they do kind of give you an example of some of the metrics we can be capturing. And I'm just going to look at one specific metric, nothing else. I'm not going to go into any other data points, but there's 15 head in this particular pen that are being monitored. It's a mere 25 by 50-foot pen. Do with that what you wish. You can tell there's a feed intake unit if you're not familiar with what that is in front of you. The little graphic up on the top is just a visual. If you look at it within the data reporting system, it shows where these animals are and that sort of thing. How do they connect these animals? Again, there are lots of different systems. So this isn't a sales pitch. It's very simple. You need a device, you need something to capture. In this case, the little button up on the top that looks like a really robust EID. That's because that's exactly what it is. It's a Bluetooth empowered EID, about the size of a marshmallow. The thing below is a sensing unit. Connects cell phone, and so it's solar powered or plug it in, get it near them, and all of a sudden you're getting activity level every little bit, about 4 times an hour, on what those creatures are doing. And so it needs to report through something. It can report through the computer, just some visuals. Mostly it reports through a cell phone for most folks, and it can give you direct push alerts. Now, here's some data you can look on that small pin. And to be honest, there's 15 head. And if you count the blue bars, you'll say it truncated the last two to get them on the screen here for you. But what you're seeing here is kind of for those of you who might wear a smartwatch, why would you do that, right? It allows you to gauge individualized performance and how you deviate from your normal individualized performance allows you to make decisions based upon that. Same thing here. We have some animals that you can see kind of their aggregate step count from a period of 1/7, January 7th till this morning. I checked this morning. And you can see we have animals who move different amounts. And the last two, as you could probably figure, actually are a little bit lower than the two next to them. And so I'm going to start with this because it's going to lead us somewhere. And you can see that in that amount of time, you had a calf who moved almost 400 steps in that amount of time to an animal who moved well south of that. All of these in that same pin. So another visual to look at. Again, you can dissect this. You can go into this much closer detail, but different ways to view that data. But where I want to go with this is here's exactly how this happened in one individualized case. So this is not the health alert for that calf, to be clear. It's a stock photo. But on a particular day, a notification was sent to a phone. It's just a push, like many notifications you might get on your smartphone. And you click on it, it tells you something like this on that phone. In this case, there's a health alert. You can click on that, and it tells you this animal this time. So in this case, calf 1899 on January 4th at 11:24. You could click on it and get some more details. Now, the point is, it allows you a moment of intervention. It allows you to make some decisions, take an action, or ignore the action if you want. But nobody had to be out there with the calves. They just did their thing. Now, here's actually what happened. And I want to work you through kind of a unique situation. So this 1899, I've kind of got some blue bars blocking off who owns these cattle and where they're at and stuff like that. So forgive the random bars in different places. But if you went on the computer and looked a little deeper into this animal, got the same graphic. Now you click on that creature. So it happens, you probably couldn't tell it in the earlier photo, but there were a couple red calves in that pen. This is a red calf. Really, that's not germane to this particular conversation. But you can see I ran a report from January 1 to January 21. And always ignore the last day, right? Just like if you were looking at your own smartwatch data, the day's not done yet. The data's not reported. So you got to ignore the last day. But past that, the trend line looked pretty good, except for if you look very early in that, you see a spike that's pretty high and a trough that's pretty low. That's curious. Right there. And this is and this is the point, by the way, where that animal threw its health alert because its activity level had fallen to a certain level. Now, as we start looking into that data, trying to discern what was wrong with that animal, because you should know immediately after it threw that health alert, management went, studied the creature, got the animal up, and said, "There's no temp, there's no sign of discharge, nothing looks bad." But they've used the system enough to know that you don't take that. That sometimes the system is days ahead of actual signs of illness, and so they monitored the creature aggressively for the next few days, and nothing happened. So it's like, oh my gosh, we got a false alert. That's a problem. That's a real problem. But I point out this little spike right here on January 2nd, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That animal got 1,800 steps or better. But then look at the bottom. It was also a lot of activity around that. So one has to be curious because all these activity levels are based off of like week-long rolling averages and that kind of thing. So what happened? Note, I've changed my scale. I've zoomed in a little bit from now I'm just January 1st to approaching January 6th. And you can see, again, if you can see my circle right there, that's where our health alert got through. But largely that was influenced by a very extended period of hours where this animal got really, really active. And that threw off the number. So the question is why? So it says, okay, that's maybe a bit of an erroneous health alert. I got to understand what happened. Well, here's what happened. Um, we started looking, and that spike. These are bedded pins. They get cleaned and bedded. And what we learned is those animals spent an extended period of time outside of their pen. And so when we were going and looking for genetic clues or phenotype clues, which we get all the time, every day on these cattle and others, but in this situation, we actually found an HR issue. An employee had allowed those animals to spend an extended period of time outside of their pen. And that it was unnecessary and those sort of things. But you can see the system actually found an HR concern as opposed to an actual health concern in this particular event. So that's just one very specific example. And maybe it's the kind of example a lot of folks wouldn't show because it says, hey, I threw a false health alert. It did. But there is always a reason. So what's the reason? In this case, we found a very useful data point, knowledge point that we could transfer on. So that's an example of some of the things that I think are most impactful in today's selection of sires. The industry knows quite well what genetics are most front and center. And so the question is what are we going to do with some of these next steps? Red meat yield's certainly going to be a next step. Liver discussions are certainly going to be ongoing, and the like. But one of the areas I think is individual animal monitoring all level is going to give us an opportunity to get each of those areas of concern a little more clarity. And with that, I am going to be quiet. And if possible, I'm going to bring myself up so I can see everybody. And Fred, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Trip. Very interesting presentation. Dustin posed a question. Is there significant differences within breeds on dry matter intake and feed conversion?
Uh, Certainly there are, though I would tell you, I would rephrase the question just a little bit. I would say there are significant differences across all types of cattle. And within a breed, there's probably the old analogy that says, hey, uh, there's more variation within a breed than without, really would hold true here. So I would just caution to make it too much about a singular breed, though there are definitely differences, and say, okay, let's study a little deeper. And that's where I think some of the discussion here at the end of this talk comes into play because what we're going to find is there are animals within some of the breeds that didn't make this list of five, right? But maybe you're a Gelbvieh breeder. I can assure you, I've done the data. There are some Gelbvieh cattle that would work really well in this, or balancer cattle. There's not a lot of critical mass in that population, so some folks might overlook them. And there are certainly other breeds. That's just one example. And at the same time, I assure you, there are Angus cattle and Simmental cattle and Limousin cattle and Wagyu cattle and Charolais cattle who are terrible fits for this system, yet they're used as well. So uh, that is that is about as a vague and rambling answer as you can get. But to say, absolutely there is. If somebody would like to look into a particular sire or sire group, and they'd like to get some information on those or compare some metrics, be happy to offline on that with somebody. And Fred, my email address is on the screen for a reason. And so if they have a question about that, they are welcome to use it.
Absolutely. Uh, we've got a question from Dan. A vertically integrated beef on dairy system has the opportunity to measure bull fertility. Does such a vertical system enable selection on the basis of the trait which has not been able to be measured in the native beef system?
Certainly it does. Yeah, this is so one thing I probably should have said, but didn't. But Dan throws me a softball here because I think what he does is make a point. The beef on dairy model has made the traditional beef business better. Um, as those of you vested in this business have focused so hard on using data to make wise decisions, and you have structures that just don't exist in the traditional side, traditional beef business side, absolutely. You all have driven the bus and have encouraged the beef business to step up to the extent you should know. So first, clearly, yes is the answer to Dan. As an offshoot to that question, it's forcing folks in the native beef business to start to use some other novel tools that do some of the things I've described in different environments to try to capture those same sort of things. So absolutely. And I think beef folks largely see opportunities to work with dairy folks on occasion, specifically because they want fertility understanding other sires they just can't get otherwise.
That kind of leads into a question that came in. Dairymen often are not familiar with the verbiage of indexes in the beef industry. Can you help us kind of come to focus on what do we need to look at on these beef indexes?
Yeah, absolutely. Though, of course, dairy folks use them, right? You have
Yep.
metrics that are essentially indexes. Some of your large profit tools are really indexes. To me, this, I don't want to get off in the weeds on too much genetic nonsense. The build of an index is important. Some indexes are built well, some aren't built well, to be frank. However, the advantage in this space is what we're interested from a beef on dairy standpoint are very well known, very well understood metrics. The two biggest metrics we talk about are growth and the range of carcass metrics. So growth and the range of carcass metrics. We understand those. They're highly heritable, and as a result, we can make selection decisions, well, highly and moderately heritable. And so we can make strong genetic decisions based on those. As a result of the fact that all we're worried about on this side in the beef on dairy equation are terminal metrics, which is largely those two, until we have other things like health and fertility. It makes these things pretty clear. So even a somewhat poor crafted beef on dairy or terminal index in the beef business is still pretty good because we understand those traits pretty well. So in a private conversation, over a cup of coffee or maybe over an adult beverage late in the day at NCBA. If you want to come, we can talk about my thoughts on some of the different builds on some of those indexes and which ones are better or worse. But largely, those terminal indexes are quite credible. Now, the problem, and this is at some point, we all have to start to grow up and build tools that can speak across the population instead of all these individualized tools that are meant to that are purely about marketing advantage and less about actually giving education to the folks who are trying to use them. Would it be nice? Would it be responsible? Would it be mature if we could say, here is an industry-wide trusted beef on dairy index that use some of those things? Yeah, it'd be nice, but not going to happen. So in lieu of that, you're forced to do, silly stuff. And if you're looking at Angus bulls or Simmental bulls or Limousin bulls or what have you, you're going to just look at their individual metrics. For example, Angus has very specific Angus on Holstein, Angus on Jersey metrics. Simmental has their terminal index. Limousin has a couple different terminal indexes. So Wagyu would probably be the one slightly nuanced thing there, but most of those decisions, to be honest, are being made inside of large corporate structures where they're doing some of their own internal stuff. And again, Charlet has terminal metrics. And so I think you can lean into most of the indexes of the breeds that I mentioned. Wagyu would be a little harder, but they do have them. You just have to do a little more work. And for the most part, higher's better on that terminal index, only because you can work in this space with reckless disregard for other traits that would impact a native beef producer.
Okay, now I'm going to kind of step my toe in the political side. With the new nutrition pyramid that obviously puts all of our animal proteins up at the broadest portion of the pyramid, are we going to have to shoot for more grinder meat? Is the dairy on beef situated better than maybe it was before when the prime rib and the sirloin was king?
Well, I guess I would take. So I appreciate your political toe dipping. Um, so first of all, that's a win. For us, the new food pyramid. I want to take a step back from what's good for me or you in the business, right? Because too too often we get angry at folks because they do things different than we would, and what we really find out is fundamentally they just have a different worldview, and so their sensitivities to certain businesses look different. I'd rather think about what's the right thing to do. And when we look at the right thing, there are certainly some exceptions, and I'm not going to tell you I'm the most knowledgeable on the food pyramid. But I think in general, most of us know that's a better way to consume food, right? It's just a better way to feed an engine. And so I think that's a positive for animal proteins largely. I think it's a huge opportunity for the beef business. Um, and now, specifically to where we fit in from that grinding conversation, I think it's still going to continue to be the same conversation we're having at present and have been having for a long time. We do a tremendous job at making the highest quality, meaning the most palatable, most appealing eating experience on the planet. As long as folks globally are willing to pay us very significant premiums to do that, it's going to be really hard pressed to see many folks chasing a lot of high trim when they can buy that cheaper from other sources, right? And if I were running a dairy, I would be a little nervous, barring somebody paying me really, really well, from turning off my genetic selections to make cattle that can go and fight and be competitive in the commodity beef business, to make high choice and prime carcasses, um, to go try to make cattle that be more suitable for grinding. I'd probably lose money in the near term and probably in the long term if I were going to do that. Now, the flip side, clearly, some of the value comes, and we don't often think about this, but the fat that's trimmed from our carcasses is hugely valuable now, right? Hugely valuable. So even on some of those fat animals, whether that's a beef on dairy animal being trimmed a little bit, which, by the way, are not nearly as fat as native beef cattle, as you all would probably intuit, or native beef, that fat, I'm not going to tell you it's worth the same as lean trim because that would be wrong, but it's worth a lot for two reasons. One, Biofuels are a huge opportunity and seems no reason to think they won't continue to do that. They bring a lot of money into a packing plant, biofuel dollars. But then the other is that trim that people bring in still needs fat to go get mixed with it. And so that fat, because you can buy lean trim from either cows or bulls or other parts of the world, it needs fat added. And so 50/50 trim, you heard earlier, I worked in a packing plant, so I have a lot of friends in that sector, and they are stunned when they talk to me about the value of 50/50 or just high fat concentrations because they've never seen these kind of values for that before. And a lot of that is just to offset some of that lean trim. So that's to tell you, I don't. Everybody has a different business model. We started we are having that conversation earlier. And if your business model leans well for somebody to pay you enough to make cattle that have more grind in them than others, hey, knock your bad self out. I would venture in today's market, that's not going to be very many people that we will talk to.
Very good. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. Uh, Chip, I'd like to thank you for sharing this information and your insights on strategies concerning beef sow selection for dairy cows. I'd like to remind everybody this program has been recorded and will be available on the I-29 Moo University website located at i29moou.com. It'll take about 3 to 5 working days for us to get it up. Once it is up, I will email you notification and include the link for the program evaluation. I'd encourage everybody to take a minute, let us know some information so we can continue to make these dairy beef dialogue webinars even more useful for people. I look forward to seeing you at the webinar next month. And at this point, I will close this webinar. Thank you, Chip.
Thank you, Fred.